Hello, Archie Dunlop here with Talking Astrology with Archie. And in this video, I'm going to be looking at the weekend of May the 24th and 25th, 2025. Now, one thing that does happen this weekend is that Saturn moves into Aries, and this is an important event. So, Saturn has a cycle of, just over 29 years, so it doesn't change sign very often, and when it does, that is something that we really do need to consider. So at the end of this video, I'm going to be looking at in detail at Saturn in Aries and what it might mean. But before I look at Saturn in Aries, I want to look at the astrology and the I Ching for the weekend. By the way, if you want to like the video or subscribe, feel free. It does make a difference to the channel. So here is the picture for the weekend. Set for midnight on Sunday. That would be Sunday the 25th, and set for New York. And so midnight, the moon is at 6 degrees Taurus. So that does mean that the moon starts the weekend in Aries, and then it sort of ends the weekend in Taurus. To be precise, the moon moves into Taurus London time, early evening. I think sort of 6:38 p.m. So if you're in Europe or Africa, then for most of Saturday the moon is moving through Aries, and by Saturday evening it's in Taurus, and of course all of Sunday the moon is in Taurus. So if you're in the Americas, moon moves into Taurus, earlier on Saturday, and so you could say that most of the weekend, if not all the weekend, the moon is in this sign. It's in Taurus, and as far as the big aspects, the big non-lunar aspects are concerned, well, Saturday sees a trine between the Sun and Pluto. So this aspect can be quite transformative, and it allows us to create change. And so if we're not happy about things, well, maybe they're the way to make some alterations. And if we're quite tough about it, then I think people will listen to us. So, you don't have to be satisfied with the status quo. Things can be upset, but upset in such a way that, it doesn't cause too much drama. Also on Saturday, we have a conjunction between Mercury and Uranus. So Mercury and Uranus make this conjunction at around 28 Taurus, and so Mercury conjunct Uranus can be about having things to say, perhaps having lots of things to say, and being very clear about our likes and dislikes, and perhaps not being in the mood for changes of mind. Now, I know that the Sun is in Gemini, and one associates the Sun in Gemini with flexibility and being able to move from one place to another, indeed one set of ideas to another. But Mercury is still in Taurus. Mercury does move into Gemini pretty soon. I think actually Mercury moves into Gemini on Monday. But with this Mercury-Uranus conjunction, well, it could be about news, surprising news. We hear something and it changes everything. And also Mercury conjunct Uranus, it can be a little bit explosive, but it's explosive perhaps in a mercurial sense. It's maybe more about sort of what people say, ideas than action. And then on Sunday, Saturn moves into Aries, and I'm not sure if we're going to necessarily feel Saturn moving into Aries the moment it happens. I mean, Saturn is an outer planet, and it's not something that we immediately get, but it's a reminder that things really have changed. And Saturn moving from Pisces to Aries it's a big sign change, and Saturn is going across the Aries point, and so the Aries point is about the world, and so Saturn conjunct the Aries point, we perhaps start to see the problems of the world and the limitations of the world. But as I will be discussing later in a video, it's very difficult to make generalizations about Saturn in Aries. There are different times when Saturn is in Aries. I mean, Saturn went into Aries in the sort of mid to late 1990s, late 1960s, and those are two very different periods of time. It also went into Aries at the end of the 1930s, and so each of those periods had different qualities, and I'm very wary of making generalizations. But Saturn on the Aries point, it is a time when we are aware not necessarily of our own limitations, but of the world's limitations. But Saturn in Aries is not necessarily a disastrous thing. I mean, if you think about the late 1990s, well, the late 1990s, had their ups and downs, but there were positive things going on in the late 1990s. It was often a time of real optimism. I mean, there were big events, dramatic events. Things happened in the Middle East just after Saturn went into Aries in the 90s, and I'll be talking about those later in the video. But we shouldn't necessarily feel that it is a huge event, Saturn moving into Aries, at least in a personal sense. So that's the picture for New York. If we set the chart for Sydney, Australia for midnight, then the moon is still in Aries by the end of Saturday. So that is a reminder that if you are in Australia, Saturday is just a completely moon in Aries day, but Sunday moon will move into Taurus, and so then if you are in Australia and New Zealand, then you, like everyone else, will feel the impact of moon being in a fixed sign, and moon, for example, making a square to Pluto, and so that's the difference. I'm not saying it's a huge difference. It's more of a difference of timing. And then there is the heliocentric view. Here it is, where you put things from the view of the sun, and Mars is at 23 Virgo. So Mars is now getting very close to an opposition of Saturn, and it's happening at the same time as geocentrically Saturn is moving into Aries. So with Saturn moving into Aries geocentrically, at the same time as you have a heliocentric Mars-Saturn opposition, then you might say that there is a feeling of frustration, that things aren't necessarily working as quickly as you might like them to. So this weekend, don't feel that you can do everything at once, and there may be times when you need to just slow things down and just not assume that there's going to be sort of instant action. So try to be patient if at all possible. Mars is also making a quincunx to Chiron. Quincunx heliocentrically, I'm not saying that is a hugely significant aspect, but it may add to this feeling of frustration. We want to do things which are different, but for one reason or another, it may not be easy. So that's the heliocentric picture. And now I want to look at the weekend from the viewpoint of the 12 signs. So these are my forecasts for the 12 signs for the weekend of May the 24th and 25th, 2025. Aries. Aries, Saturn is moving into your sign. And this is a big event. And okay, Saturn does actually leave Aries later in the year. It's not, it's not in Aries forever. I mean, when does Saturn leave Aries? Saturn leaves Aries because it goes retrograde, of course. So Saturn retrogrades out of Aries. When does that happen? Sort of late August, early September. So certainly over summer, you will have Saturn moving through Aries. You get a break when Saturn moves back into Pisces, but of course Saturn will return to Aries and then it will stay there for a year or two. So the problem with Saturn in Aries is that Saturn is in its fall in Aries. It's not a great place for Saturn to be, and Saturn and Aries, you could say, are two really very different principles. Aries is the principle of action, taking the initiative. Saturn is about consolidation and not being in a rush, taking things slowly. So Saturn can find it very difficult to work in Aries. So, with Saturn moving into Aries, all things being equal, you might have to slow things down and not be in a hurry to get fast results. And, the world is slow. You have to deal with base matter, objects, restraints, restrictions. These are part of everyday living. So when you look at the summer, certainly if you want to achieve anything, then you're going to have to do it in a slow, methodical way. Sorry, apologies, I say the summer. I know there's a Northern Hemisphere bias there, so if you're in Australia or New Zealand, that would be the winter. But with Saturn moving into Aries, you do have to be slower and more considered, and not get frustrated. And perhaps that's the way of dealing with it. You have to sort of give yourself more time to be doing things. But on the plus side, Saturn moving into Aries, it's a time to be taking yourself seriously. The games and the hesitation is now over. You in the past you might have tried one thing, tried another thing, and it might not have worked. And now, with Saturn moving into Aries, you realise that things are serious, and you've got to really do things in a slow and methodical way. And as far as the specifics of the weekend are concerned, then I think that Saturday is different from Sunday. On Saturday, the moon is moving through Aries, and the next time the moon is moving through Aries, the moon will be doing it with Saturn also in Aries. But for the moment, moon moving through Aries, moving through late Aries on Saturday, you can do pretty much what you want. I think you will have a lot of freedom. Moon is making a sextile to Jupiter. So if there's anything you want to do, maybe you should do it on Saturday, rather than Sunday. So that's that's something you might want to consider. On Sunday, the moon is making a square to Mars, and so with that moon square Mars, it's possible that you feel that there's something you have to deal with that you don't really want to have to deal with, but you somehow have to. And it's not just the fact that moon is square Mars. The moon is The moon is also, it's moving from a square to Pluto to a square to Mars, and the moon is therefore going to be aspecting the moon, the Mars-Pluto midpoint, and so that might be about something that you don't really want to have to deal with. It could have a financial element to it. So where there's money, there's trouble, but some things can't be helped. So if there's a financial issue on Sunday, then you have no choice. You do have to deal with it. And so that's the weekend. Saturn in Aries, it is an important event, does affect you, does take place over the weekend, but does that mean you have to be really concerned about Saturn moving into Aries? I don't think you do. Remember, all things being equal, 1 in 12 people are in Aries. Well, that depends, actually. If you are reading this from a perspective of rising signs, and you're in the Northern Hemisphere, then relatively few people have Aries rising. And the further north, the fewer people with Aries rising there are. In fact, Aries rising in the Northern Hemisphere, for example, if you were in Scandinavia, it's a relatively rare rising sign. On the other hand, if you're in Australia, it's a relatively common rising sign. So it's not a case with rising signs that they are equally distributed. Aries in the Northern Hemisphere is relatively unusual. On the other hand, if you're looking at it from a view of the sun signs, then you could say that roughly 1 in 12 people have their suns in Aries, and so people have to deal with Saturn in Aries, and they do deal with it, and they prosper with Saturn in Aries. So don't worry about it too much. Taurus, this weekend the moon does move into your sign. Quite when it moves into your sign, rather depends on, where you are. So if you're in the Americas, then sort of late morning, early afternoon, maybe around lunchtime, the moon will move into Taurus. So really, you can say that the whole weekend is about moon in Taurus. If you're in Europe, then it won't be until this evening, Saturday evening, that you get moon moving into Taurus. Of course, if you're in Australia or New Zealand, it won't be until Sunday that the moon makes that sign change. But moon moving into Taurus, whenever it does make that sign change, is something that is quite invigorating. It reminds you of your priorities. Perhaps you'd recently sort of forgotten about what you were supposed to be doing, and you were thinking about something else. But now it starts to become clear again, and you're helped by the fact that the moon is making a square to Pluto. Moon in Taurus making a square to Pluto in Aquarius, and that aspect can actually be quite ambitious. You have a feeling for what you need to do, and you don't want to be contradicted. In fact, you really don't want to be contradicted with Mercury making a conjunction to Uranus. So this Mercury conjunct Uranus takes place at the end of Taurus, and it's an aspect that might be quite stubborn. If you have something you believe in, you're really going to want to hold firm to it. And if you're having an argument with someone, well, you won't want to be contradicted. And so you're going to want to hold firm. And is that a good idea? It might actually be a good idea. If you actually believe you are right, then stick with it and be ready to see things through to the end. Well, not literally the end, but you have something to say, and if you believe it, then who am I to contradict that? But there is a time when you can be too stubborn. Taurus is a stubborn sign, as I so often say, and some of your ideas might be a little too extreme or opinionated, and it's always worth listening to alternative views. And another thing to say is that you are capable of creating surprises. That's something you absolutely can do, and you can say things which catch other people unawares. They don't realize something is true. You know it's true. You tell it as it is. That's what Taurians are very good at doing. And you tell it as it is, and you really change everything. And sometimes moments of shock can work to your advantage. As far as relationships are concerned, that Venus trine Mars that I've been going on and on about, it's still there. Still, only a degree apart, and so you continue to be able to benefit from that Venus trine Mars. It's a time when you can get on with people, and you can relate to them in new ways, and that's something you should perhaps try to take advantage of. But it really is the people who you know and trust. With Venus trine Mars, you don't have to be looking for new people, new encounters. The people you already know have got a huge amount to offer if you're prepared to give them the chance. Gemini, the big aspect this weekend is possibly the conjunction between Mercury and Uranus, but there's also a semi-sextile between Mercury and Jupiter. So Mercury making a semi-sextile to Jupiter, Mercury conjunct Uranus, that does indicate that you may be challenged. Something is perhaps holding you up intellectually, or confronting you. You thought you got it, you thought you understood it, and you become aware of something new, and that something new can change everything. And this Mercury conjunct Uranus, it may just be a realization. You come to a conclusion, and it really hits you, but it happens slowly. You see one thing, and you see another thing, and it takes a bit of time to come together. Mercury's in Taurus. It's a slow sign for Mercury to be in. And maybe in general, with Mercury in Taurus, your mind has been a bit slower and more methodical than usual. But Mercury is sort of grinding away, and suddenly you have a realization, and that could change everything. And additionally, Mercury is making a semi-sextile to Jupiter, and so that semi-sextile to Jupiter, remember, Jupiter is in Gemini, and Jupiter is in your sign. Jupiter hasn't got much longer in Gemini. In a couple of weeks it will be out, it will be in Cancer, and you'll have to wait 11 years for it to come back into Gemini. And so there is a challenge there. You may realize that you've done a lot, but it's not enough, that you have to go further. And so you haven't finished, and you have to really move things to a new level. And this Mercury sextile Jupiter, semi-sextile Jupiter, might also be saying something about you and other people. Mercury semi-sextile Jupiter can be about you and another person having a different view. I won't say a difference of opinion or an argument, just a different view, a different approach. And your first instinct might be to think that your way is the best way, but I don't think that's the right reaction. You need to be able to learn from another person. In fact, they need to learn from you as well. So finding the right accommodation with someone else, with this Mercury semi-sextile Jupiter, could be important. And it's quite possible that there's something you're missing, something you haven't been doing, and another person is aware of this, or through their actions or through the things they say, they are reminding you of this fact. So it's actually quite possible, Gemini, that you can learn a great deal from another person. Cancer. Cancer, you could say that I should be doing two horoscopes for you. I should be doing a horoscope for Saturday and a horoscope for Sunday. Because on Saturday is a day when you probably feel, or you might feel, that the week is still in progress, that there are still things that need to be done. It might not even feel like the weekend, because there are issues from Saturday that need to be looked after. And that's especially the case if you're in Europe, Asia, Australia, New Zealand. It's just unfinished business. If you're in the Americas, it's more clear cut. You do feel that things have changed and that it is the weekend, but it may still be a slow process. Even if in the Americas, Saturday morning there might be stuff to finish off that maybe relates back to what was happening on Friday. So there is that split there. But when the moon does go into Taurus, and that might be as early as Saturday morning, it may be as late as Sunday morning if you're in Australia or New Zealand. When the moon does go into Taurus, there is a change, and you can get into the swing of the weekend, and it is a time when you can be reasonably sociable. And the moon in Taurus, the moon is exalted in Taurus, and you can enjoy other people's company, provided nothing too dramatic happens. I mean, the moon does make a square to Pluto, it does make a square to Mars. So if you are in other people's company, if you're socializing, avoid matters which are too controversial, which seem to be just complicated and be laden with controversy. That's not really something you want to get involved in, because it's just going to be more trouble than it's worth. Now, possibly the main event of the weekend is Saturn moving into Aries. And so Saturn moves into Aries, London time, sort of 4:35. I think it's 4:35 in the morning on Sunday. I'm not saying you're going to actually feel Saturn moving into Aries the moment it happens, but Saturn stays in Aries, over the summer. It does actually briefly leave Pisces, but in the end, it goes back into Aries and stays in Aries, or rather, not goes back into Aries, goes forward into Aries, because retrograde motion pushes it back into Pisces. But in the end, it will stay in Aries for a year or two, and with Saturn in Aries, there are certainly challenges, and it is about what's important to you and where you feel you want to go. And it says something about your ambitions, and you may have to look at your ambitions in a new way. So being successful, whatever success means to you, is going to be important over the next couple of years, but it's not necessarily going to be easy. because Saturn is fallen in Aries, because Saturn is exalted in Libra, therefore it's fallen in Libra. Sorry, therefore it's fallen in Aries, and so it might be at times a bit of a grind, and you cannot assume that everything is just going to work out for you automatically. You're going to just have to keep going, and it will require some patience. And it's always a problem, astrologically, when I'm telling you something which doesn't just last a day, which may last a couple of years, and that might not be something you want to hear. But you don't want to exaggerate it. I mean, you have to understand, this is a fairly general approach to astrology. There are lots and lots of Cancerians out there, and Saturn's going to move into Aries, and they will find a way of dealing with Saturn in Aries. And if they deal with it in the right way, they can do it in such a way that is really very effective. But you just have to get the approach right, and just accept that things won't always be easy, but you've just got to keep grinding forward. And there'll be moments when you get impatient, when you get frustrated, but if you can actually see through it all, then in the end you'll be able to really make the most of Saturn moving into Aries. And additionally, Saturn moving into Aries, may say something about other people. I mean, Saturn rules Capricorn, which is your opposite sign. And so Saturn may say something about another person. And it's Saturn moving from Pisces to Aries. It could be about another person who really starts to want to be assertive. They want to make a name for themselves. They want to make an impact. And then the question is, are they going to make it? Are they going to manage? Because Saturn in Aries, it can try too hard, but it might in the end fall flat on its face because someone is trying to take things too quickly. And that may be the story of the next couple of years. It may not just be about you, it may be about some of the people you meeting people who are in a hurry. And even though they're in a hurry, they seem ambitious, but it just doesn't work out for them. And it could be a time where you actually have to deal with other people's failure. It's not a failure, by the way, that is inevitable, but it is a failure of trying to do things too quickly. So that may say something about other people's. And if you're in a relationship, and so if you anticipate being in a relationship, in the same relationship with the same person over the next couple of years, that might give you a certain responsibility, a responsibility to make sure that this person doesn't try to take things too quickly, doesn't be in too much of a hurry, isn't too impulsive. Because with Saturn in Aries, you do not want to be impulsive. I mean, impulsiveness could actually be very dangerous. Leo, the week starts with the weekend starts with a trine between the Sun and Pluto. So the Sun and Pluto, they make a favorable aspect. The Sun is your ruler, and so with the Sun trine Pluto, I do think that you are in a position where you really can make things happen, and you shouldn't doubt yourself. So if you're feeling unhappy with the way things are going, it's nothing you have to put up with. You can make the change, and you can make it clear that you're not happy with the current situation and that you want to move on to something else. And you might actually want to move on rapidly to something else. It might just be a sudden transition that you want to bring about. And I think you really can do it. And you might actually be helped by the attitude of other people. Other people could have a role to play, And in the process, your perception of other people, might change. So, Leo, if you're feeling, at all frustrated over the weekend, you don't have to feel frustrated. You can be the one who indeed creates change. And, by the end of a weekend, we have the moon in Taurus. And so with the moon in Taurus, this is again a reminder that there are things you want, to happen, and you're quite ambitious, and you have ideas about how you'd like things to work out, and you may not want to keep these ideas to yourself. So, overall this weekend, you are pretty dynamic, and so it is a weekend where you can certainly make things happen. I should say something about Saturn moving into Aries. It's an important event for everyone. For you, Saturn's movement into Aries might say something about other people and the people around you. I was just talking to Cancer, and I was talking to Cancer about Saturn in Aries, and I mentioned to Cancer that Saturn in Aries might have an impact on relationships. And while it's true that Saturn, Cancer, and Leo are very different signs, they do have one thing in common. Both Saturn and Leo, they're opposite signs. Capricorn is opposition Cancer, Aquarius is opposition Leo. Their opposite signs are both ruled by Saturn. So for you, when Saturn moving into Aries may say something about the other person, the people you come across. And some of the people you come across are ambitious, they're in a hurry, they want things to happen, they want to move on to something new, and it's all very nice. But the question is, are they going to be successful? And we shouldn't forget that Saturn is making a conjunction to Neptune now. And so Saturn's at 0 degrees Aries, Neptune is at 1 or 2 degrees Aries. So some of the people around you could be very confused. They may say they want to do things, they may promise the earth, but are they actually going to be able to deliver? Almost certainly not. And that might mean, Leo, that you are surrounded by over-ambition. It's not you being over-ambitious, it's other people being over-ambitious. And it's about having aims that are simply impossible. They just cannot be achieved. And so, Leo, in certain situations, you might have to be a moderating influence. And I'm not just talking about today, I'm talking about the next few months. And of course, Saturn does leave Aries and goes back into Pisces in the autumn, early autumn, but then it does return to Aries, and it does stay there for a couple of years. Virgo, we have a conjunction between Mercury and Uranus, and this Mercury-Uranus conjunction might be quite exciting and dramatic. After all, Mercury is your ruler, and so when Mercury makes the conjunction with Uranus, that can really stir you up, and you might think you know everything, that you've understood everything, but then Mercury conjuncts Uranus, and you see new information. You become aware of things that you just hadn't thought of before, and it could change everything. And Virgo, in a way, you need to dare yourself to be surprised. And if you have strong views, perhaps you should be putting these views to the test. Do they work in reality? And if you talk about your views, what kind of response do you get? And I think you could get quite a dramatic response. And when you get a dramatic response, that can mean several things. It could mean you've got something really amazing to say. It could also mean that you've jumped to conclusions and you've got yourself into a situation where some of your beliefs just cannot work out, and you're getting negative feedback from the outside world. But whatever's going on, I do think that this Mercury-Uranus conjunction is quite exciting and challenging. And yeah, you can do the challenging, but you can also be challenged. And additionally, we have a semi-sextile between Mercury and Jupiter. So Jupiter in Gemini is challenging Mercury in Taurus. And you might think that you've sorted everything out, then Jupiter in Gemini comes along, because Jupiter is exactly 30 degrees from Mercury. So again, you're seeing things in a different way, or you're being forced to see things in a different way. And as a result of that, you might have to change your approach, or at least you would be advised to change your approach. And this Mercury semi-sextile Jupiter might say something about relationships. So Mercury in Taurus, that could be sort of you set in your ways, at least relative to another person, and another person comes up with something different. And your first inclination is to reject what another person represents. But, when you think about it again, you start to see that you're being offered something. So don't just reject something because it seems unusual or revolutionary or outside your own carefully worked out plans. But you yourself can be a revolutionary if you want to be, with that Mercury conjunct Uranus. And you clearly have ideas which are important, but you shouldn't be too precious about your ideas, because events and external reactions might force you to just reconsider some of your core beliefs. Libra, Saturn is moving into Aries, and this movement could be quite important. And one has to consider what it might mean and how you should adjust to the realities of Saturn moving into Aries. So if we take a sort of a textbook view of Libra, I mean, this is not necessarily the real view of Libra, but just a textbook view, a stereotypical view, then Libra is the sign of balance. And Libra is supposed to be a very socially orientated sign. Other people matter if you're a Libra. And most Librans want to fit in. I mean, there is a large minority of Librans who actually don't want to fit in at all. They want everyone to balance with them rather than them balancing to the rest of the world. I mean, Margaret Thatcher, for example, had her sun in Libra. So with Saturn moving into Libra, this may say something about you and other people and how that relationship, works out. And, ask yourself, to what extent are you reliant on other people? To what extent do you try to fit in? Or indeed, to what extent are you a stereotypical Libra? You might not be a stereotypical Libra, but if you are in a position where other people do matter, or you're in a relationship and you're perhaps giving the other person maybe more power than they deserve, then Saturn moving into Aries could actually be quite frustrating. You might start to realize the limitations of some of the relationships in your life. Perhaps you've given too much away. Perhaps you don't have as much power as you should have. And so if you are in an existing relationship, then you may start to see the shortcomings of the other person. And it's not just because Saturn's in Libra, it's also because Neptune's in Libra as well. But now we've got a Saturn-Neptune conjunction taking place in Aries. And so the Saturn-Neptune conjunction in Aries is, it's having an impact on you. So that's one way of looking at it. Now, if you are looking for a relationship, or you're single, or you're looking for other people in your life, well, you might say that Saturn in moving into Aries might mean that you have high expectations. That's what Saturn can be about. You are not satisfied with second best. That could be the case, and you might start to have ideas about what kind of relationship you'd like to be in, and you might then realize that what you're looking for is potentially impossible, because you're not going to be able to find someone who matches that. And then there's an alternative approach to Saturn in Libra, sort of the more sort of psychological approach. And if you're sort of into Jungian psychology, and if you've for example, if you've read Liz Green's book on her book on Saturn, what was it, Saturn and You Look at an Old Devil, wasn't that her book on Libra? Her book on Saturn, but she wrote that was published in the 1970s. So Saturn is not necessarily about another person in the flesh. It could be about the shadow. It's everything about yourself that you don't fully recognize, and you project onto other people. And you can project your own problems and shortcomings onto other people, and there can actually be a lot of blame, like you blaming other people for what's going wrong in your life, when in fact you're projecting. So Saturn moving into Aries may be asking you to take responsibility if you feel that your life isn't working out, that there are certain areas of your life that aren't working out, and it's always someone else's fault, or it's an organization's fault, or it's the fault of circumstances. It's asking you to take responsibility. Now, it may well be the case that it is someone else's fault, but you want to have as much agency as possible. And so if you want agency, then there are advantages of regarding it all as being something to do with you. Because if something is your fault, then you have the capacity to change it. If something is the fault of the outside world, the times in which you're living, of another person, then it's difficult to make changes. So maybe with Saturn moving into Aries, the real challenge actually is to take responsibility. Scorpio, this weekend, Saturn is moving into Aries. That's certainly one thing that's going on. I don't want to make too much of a big deal about Saturn moving into Aries. I mean, Saturn moves into Aries for all of us. Aries, from a Scorpio view, it's not an angular sign, and so its influence might not be as strong as if compared to, say, for example, if you're an Aries or a Libra or a Capricorn or a Cancer. But still, Saturn moving into Aries might remind you of some of your responsibilities, and Saturn does spend the rest of the summer in Aries, and it does go back into Pisces briefly at the end of the year, but then it finally goes into Aries and stays in Aries for a couple of years. But with Saturn in Aries, you start to see things as they are, and you are aware of your responsibilities, not just to other people but also to yourself. And with Saturn in Aries, there could be a health dimension here. And I must make it clear that I'm not a medical astrologer. I'm not giving medical advice. I'm talking about health in the sort of lifestyle sense of it. I must make that clear. But, with Saturn in Aries, you could be aware of your physical limitations. Again, I'm not making any forecasts about physical limitations. It's about awareness of your physical limitations, of what you can do and what you can't do. And all of us, regardless of our age, need to be aware of our physical limitations. And with Saturn moving through Aries, be aware of physically what you can and cannot do, and perhaps adjust things accordingly. And that way you won't get frustrated, and you won't sort of overdo it. You do yourself an injury, and it might be just asking you to take things more slowly and to have an more organized approach. For example, with diet and exercise. Perhaps with diet and exercise in the past, things have been just a bit random, chaotic, casual. You haven't really had a system. And on a positive note, Saturn in Aries may be actually encouraging you to have a system for making yourself feel better and healthier, and also to be able to just deal with your limitations. Again, all of us have limitations. It's not just about age. There may be another dimension to Saturn moving into Aries, a completely different dimension. And in astrology, the sixth house is connected with smaller animals, animals which are smaller than a goat. In other words, dogs, cats, rabbits, guinea pigs, not whales or horses, dolphins. No, they're larger than a goat. So smaller animals. So the kind of animals that people usually have as pets. So with Saturn moving into Aries, that may indicate a new attitude to smaller animals. So if you have pets, or if you're considering having a pet, actually that might be how Saturn in Aries could work. Suddenly realizing that an animal brings responsibility. I'm not saying in every Scorpio's case, but that is one of the definitions of Saturn moving into Aries, because from a Scorpio perspective, Aries is the sixth house from that sign. So there could be new responsibilities towards animals over the next couple of years, or there may be a new feeling of compassion towards animals. You might regard this as being a serious issue for you suddenly, and that would probably be a very good thing. But this is a general trend. It's not like Saturn goes into Aries, moves into Aries, and suddenly everything changes. I think that it is a more sort of gradual process. Now, looking at things on a sort of a really more day-to-day level, the moon starts the weekend in Aries, it ends the weekend in Taurus, so the moon will move into Taurus at some stage over the weekend. So with the moon moving into Taurus, that could say something about other people and relationships. The moon is quite well placed in Taurus. It's exalted in Taurus. On the other hand, the moon does make a square to Pluto, and it makes a square to Mars. And that just could mean that other people, they certainly have an influence, but they could be hard work, and they could create problems that perhaps you don't really want to deal with. So relationships should not be rushed into. And although you understand that other people are powerful and can have a big influence, you have to ask, how far should that influence really go? And maybe there is a place for independent mindedness. Additionally, Scorpio, there is a conjunction between Mercury and Uranus this weekend, and this Mercury-Uranus conjunction, is in Taurus, your opposite sign, and that might be about something someone does, something someone says, and it might be surprising, might even be shocking, but you need to not make it too significant. Just because you are surprised or even shocked doesn't mean it's the end of the world, and you can probably just take things in your stride and move on. Sagittarius, Saturn is moving into Aries, and it means that Saturn's moving into a fire sign. I think that you will be influenced by Saturn moving into Aries. It's not something that is necessarily immediate, but it will start to make its influence felt over the summer. Okay, Saturn does actually leave Aries and move back into Pisces at the end of the year, but that's because of retrograde motion. But then it moves on into Aries eventually and stays there for some time. So with Saturn moving into Aries, maybe one should also see that as Saturn leaving Pisces. So Saturn has been in Pisces since the beginning of March 2023. Is that right? I think so. And I don't know how you see the last couple of years, but the last couple of years may have been about you discovering, what it means to be secure, and the issue of security and grounding and comfort, could have been very important to you, and there could have been family issues that you've been sort of working through on and off over the last couple of years, and then Saturn changes sign. So that part of your life is coming to an end. When I say part of your life, it's all about your focus. It's what you regard as being really important. And so with Saturn moving into Aries, what becomes important, what is starting to become important for a Sagittarian, and what is starting to become important is that you are able to be yourself. Aries for you is a sign that is very self-oriented, and it's about you doing things which are creative and are a natural expression of your fundamental personality, and that's what you should be striving for. And it's a bit contradictory here, because it is about fun, but it's also responsibility. So it could be that with Saturn moving through into Aries, that you're thinking about the serious business of having fun. Fun is not something you can just pluck off a tree. It's not that easy. You've got to work on it, and you've got to work on finding something that really is a fundamental part of who you are and of your creativity. And there is a responsibility here, and Saturn moving through Aries may also be about you trying to foster other people's creativity. And it's not just about you. You want other people to be free and to be expressing themselves in a happy and comfortable way, and that's definitely something you can do and something you can strive for. Now, one aspect we have over the weekend is a semi-sextile between Mercury and Jupiter. So Jupiter is important to Sagittarians because it's their ruler. And so with Mercury semi-sextile Jupiter, this aspect could be challenging. It might remind you that something needs to be changed, or that you're not doing things in an entirely correct way. You thought you were going in the right direction. Then Mercury semi-sextile Jupiter is a reminder that something else needs to be taken into consideration. And it might be that another person needs to be taken into consideration. You'd perhaps seen things in a way which was all about you, and you hadn't realized that you had discounted another person's opinion, but now you do realize. And with this, with Mercury semi-sextile Jupiter, you have a chance to align yourself with another person, and it's not an entirely easy process, but I do think that it is something you can do, and you shouldn't be surprised if you're told something unexpected which makes you change your plans, or certainly gives you pause for thought. So be ready for the unexpected, and also be prepared to benefit from the unexpected. Just because something is a surprise, just because it forces you to change your plans, doesn't necessarily mean that it is a bad thing. Capricorn, Saturn is changing signs, and for you that is of course an important event. Saturn is your ruler. It is moving into Aries. On Sunday, I make it 4:35 a.m. Sunday morning London time that Saturn moves into Aries. And so as Saturn is your ruler, and as Saturn is changing signs, that indicates that your emphasis is changing. Saturn is moving out of Pisces, into Aries, and Aries is an angular sign, and of course Capricorn is also an angular sign. So with Saturn moving into Aries, this is an event which makes you really think about what is important to you. Where do you stand, and where do you feel most comfortable? And if you are somewhere where you feel uncomfortable, then with Saturn moving into Aries, you may be thinking, well, it's time to make a change. You're not going to be happy with a situation where you are feeling out of place. And this may reflect, for example, where you live. And with Saturn in Aries, it's not that you will suddenly feel uncomfortable where you live. It's that the lack of comfort has been building up, and you suddenly see it, and you're thinking, well, now might be time to make a change. Now, it's not that you're suddenly going to feel different with Saturn moving into Aries at 4:35 a.m. on Sunday morning London time. It's not like that. It's a more gradual change, but perhaps you should start preparing for it. And so you want to be somewhere where you feel good. And for some Capricorns, Saturn moving into Aries might be a time where you want to change where you live, and it's okay. And Saturn, on and off, will stay in Aries for a few years. Okay, it does leave Aries briefly and goes back into Pisces in the autumn, but that's just a temporary reversion. By next year, Saturn will be well and truly in Aries. So don't feel that you have to stay in one place forever, and don't allow yourself to feel stuck. And Saturn in Aries can also be about responsibility, and it can be about your responsibility to your family, and family issues could be important over the next couple of years, and you may have to align to your family's needs, but also make your own opinions very clear. That does matter. But I don't want you to take Saturn in Aries too seriously. It's not the only thing going on, and this is 12 sign astrology. So don't take Saturn in Aries to heart. But I'm just talking about things from a perhaps general perspective, and looking at the specifics of the weekend. The weekend does start with the moon in Aries, and so this might be a time when issues of home and family and grounding are important. But then the moon does move into Taurus. By the end of the weekend, the moon is in Taurus. And so, with the moon in Taurus, with Mercury actually making a conjunction to Uranus, this might actually be a time where you are thinking about yourself and what you can do. So you need to do something which is really an expression of yourself, and by Sunday you should be thinking about what you want to do, not what other people want to do, or even not what other people want you to do. And you're able to have some fairly dramatic ideas, dramatic but quite playful ideas as well. So you have a certain sense of humour over the weekend, again, especially on Sunday. And this sense of humour could be surprising. And if you want to play with words, then go ahead. And in fact, by playing with words, you can unsettle people, but in a way that might actually be productive. Maybe some people need to be unsettled. They've got a bit complacent and you want to stir things up. And your sense of fun, really can really come into its own, by the end of the weekend. Aquarius, Saturn is moving into Aries, and for Aquarians, this could be an important event. After all, Saturn is your ruler. So, when Saturn changes sign, that is something that you should be aware of. And with Saturn, moving into Aries, you could say that it's moving out of Pisces. And I don't know how you experienced the last couple of years when Saturn was in Pisces. And it's probably a good test of whether astrology is working, or whether you should be worrying too much about Saturn moving into Aries. But according to the sort of theory of the 12 signs, if you take 12 sign astrology seriously, then with Saturn in Pisces, you might say that financial matters could have been more important than usual. I mean, that's certainly possible, and you had to think about money and whether there was enough money. And hopefully, with Saturn moving in through Pisces, you were able to sort of organize things. And also Saturn was in a water sign, and so with Saturn in Pisces, you might have been more sensitive than usual and been sort of more aware of sort of hidden realities, and perhaps by picking up on all this, you were able to align yourself, with whatever was going on around you, and that could have been helpful financially. But with Saturn moving into Aries, things change. Saturn moves into a fire sign, and so over the next couple of years, with Saturn moving through Aries, you may feel that you need to make more of an effort to be seen and heard, and there might be a challenge to be dynamic, and because Aries is quite a dynamic sign, and so with Saturn moving into Aries, you may feel that if you aren't dynamic, if you don't take the initiative, then somehow you are missing out. By the way, late summer, early autumn, Saturn does actually move back into Pisces for a few months. So it's not that you're completely done with Saturn in Pisces, but certainly over the summer, Saturn will be in Aries. I should make that point clear. So it's certainly good that you're going to feel a greater need to make things happen and to be more active and to be taking the initiative. But that doesn't mean that you can just take random initiatives and hope for the best. Saturn in Aries, it is fallen in Aries. Saturn is exalted in Libra, it's fallen in Aries. So you could say that Saturn doesn't actually work very well in Aries, and so don't just take random initiatives. You might feel that something has to be done. It has to be you making things happen. No, that's not necessarily the case, especially as Saturn is now making a conjunction to Neptune. And so with Saturn making a conjunction to Neptune in Aries, this conjunction, I think it is going to be important to you. It's asking you to be subtle. You can also bring down the fire of the universe with Saturn and Neptune in Aries, and you can have a really good understanding of where the universe is going, and you can make connections, and that is great. But just because you make connections doesn't necessarily mean that you can follow them through with concrete action. So you do have to get your timing right, and you have to be subtle. You have to be aware of the opportunities with Saturn in Aries. I think, for example, you're going to be very good at communicating. There are things you've got to say, things you'll want to say, and you can communicate with great power, and people will listen to you. But don't be in too much of a hurry to speak your mind. And especially this summer, Saturn's in Aries, but Saturn is making this conjunction to Neptune. So give yourself time to work out what is going on. Aquarians can be very inspired, and they can even be visionary, but you can't come to instant visions. The visions have to be worked through, and just because you believe something is the case doesn't mean that you should immediately talk about it or write about it. Just let the thing settle and just get used to Saturn being in Aries, and that could take a bit of time. Remembering that Aquarius is a fixed sign, so very often it does take you time to get used to a new reality. So that's a broader trend. Aside from that, Sun is making a trine to Pluto. I think I talked about Sun trine Pluto yesterday. I think that this weekend's Sun trine Pluto does allow you to have a real influence, and if there's anything you want to change, I think you can, but you don't have to change things in a confrontational way, just indicating that you're not happy with one thing and you want to move on to something else. And I think that people will understand. In fact, other people can help you make the change. So you're not alone in thinking that something has come to an end, but it needs to be revitalized, or indeed maybe just cast aside and replaced with something else. So there's nothing you actually have to put up with. And it's important that by Sunday that you're not too stubborn, and there is a possibility that on Sunday you might want to resist change, and you might be so stuck on one thing that you can't think about something else. But really that would be the wrong approach. And remember, on Sunday there is a conjunction between Mercury and Uranus, and it could be with that conjunction between Mercury and Uranus that in the comfort of your own home you realize something, and something becomes very clear to you, and that could change everything. Pisces, you have had Saturn moving through your sign, I think since March 2023. Anyway, Saturn is leaving Pisces this weekend. It does actually go back into Pisces. When does Saturn go back into Pisces? That takes place. Saturn goes back into Pisces late August, beginning of September. So You do get Saturn returning to your sign. That does happen. Looks like first of September, Saturn goes back into Pisces temporarily. But for the moment, Saturn is leaving Pisces. Sunday, I make it 3:35 a.m. London time. Saturn is out of your sign, and that could be quite welcome. With Saturn in your sign, you haven't been typically Piscean. Saturn may have imposed a structure and a responsibility upon you that wasn't always very welcome. And so Saturn moving into Aries, you might feel that you've got rid of something. And perhaps we shouldn't even think about what it means for Saturn to be in Aries. The point is, it's out of Pisces. I mean, if we were to say some things about Saturn in Aries, well, we could talk about money, and we could talk about financial obligations and feelings that there are financial issues that need to be sorted out. Don't rush it if you do feel that way. Saturn in Aries can be about wanting to make things happen quickly, but the reality being that we can't be fast about it. If we try to be fast, if we try to get everything at once, then things can go wrong. So if you feel with Saturn going into Aries that something needs to be resolved very quickly, particularly if it's of a financial nature, then you need to step back. You need to be patient. Things are not going to get resolved overnight. But I don't think you should worry too much about what it means for Saturn to be in Aries. I think it's more that Saturn is moving out of your sign, and over the summer, while Saturn is in Aries, enjoy the new reality. And there may be a feeling that a responsibility has gone, and that you actually feel freer and more able to make your own choices. And as far as the specifics of a weekend are concerned, well, Mercury is making a semi-sextile to Jupiter. That could be an important aspect, relatively speaking. There aren't so many major aspects over the weekend, but this aspect involves Jupiter, which is your ruler. So Mercury semi-sextile Jupiter could be a challenge, and you may think that you want to do things in one way, that you're quite happy where you are and you don't want to budge, and then Mercury comes along, makes the sextile to Jupiter, and so it's the semi-sextile to Jupiter, and says, hold on, there is perhaps something else you should be thinking about. Have you forgotten something? And it could be another person who is the bearer of that news, or who tries to encourage you to look at things in a new way. And your first impulse, may not be very sympathetic. You may not want to change, but Mercury semi-sextile Jupiter is encouraging you to look at things in a new way. And also Mercury is making a conjunction to Uranus. And so Mercury conjunct Uranus could say something about how other people are behaving and what they're saying. And you might hear something that you weren't expecting, that doesn't fit in with your current view of reality, and your first impulse might be to just to ignore it, or to tell someone they're wrong. But if you've reached a stage where you're telling someone they're wrong, then maybe it's you who have got it wrong, or maybe you at the very least need to consider what someone is saying. It might not be someone, it might be just a piece of news, something you hear, and it doesn't completely fit with your current view of the world, with your current ideas about security and what makes you feel comfortable. So with that Mercury semi-sextile Jupiter, there may be a challenge to be more open-minded. And the Mercury semi-sextile Jupiter may also say something about relationships. And, with Mercury semi-sextile Uranus, you and another person may not see things in the same way, but that doesn't mean to say that you haven't got things that you need to do together. And that's it. Those are my forecasts of the 12 signs, rather dominated by Saturn's movement into Aries. Of course, Saturn moving into Aries is a longer term trend, and we may not feel it in the very short term. So now I want to look at the weekend from the viewpoint of the I Ching. And so, I asked the question, what is the weekend going to be like for those watching the I Ching section of this video? And the first hexagram I got was hexagram 2, which is the receptive. You can see here with this hexagram that all of the 6 lines are broken, and it is a hexagram which is about negativity. It is pure yin as opposed to yang. I think I got the yin and the yang the right way around. And so there is nothing that has to be done. It's not about creating things. It's not about taking the initiative. It's about responding to what is happening around you. It is about watching. It is about observing. It's about shaping yourself to the current situation. So, don't feel this weekend, especially at the beginning of a weekend, that you have any great control. That doesn't mean to say that you're going to be pushed around. In fact, the less you engage, the less you try to push your personality onto the world, then in a way, the more control you have. Because if you don't resist, then you're ignored, and it's all fine. But it's when you try to be creative, when you try to force things through, then things can go wrong. So it's about observing rather than acting. And it's not a position where you can really initiate things. Now, there is a moving line, and the second line from the bottom moves, and it's a fortunate line, and it is about a natural flow of things, and one thing moves on to the other. And what the I Ching says, at least as I understand it, is that you have a line, and a line naturally moves into a square, and a square naturally moves into a cube. So there's a natural progress, and one thing naturally leads to another, and just follow that flow, and you don't have to make any effort. If you're making any effort this weekend, particularly at the beginning of a weekend, then you're doing something wrong. One thing will move on to another thing, and it will be fine. Now, we have a moving line. Second line from the bottom moves, and that means that this hexagram moves to hexagram number 7, which is the army. So there's still a certain feeling of passivity about the army, because you need to understand your role in a larger group. We know we've had the army quite recently. Are you a leader or are you a follower? And leaders at some level are actually followers because they're part of a hierarchy. And so if you can become part of something by the end of a weekend, that might actually be a useful thing to do. But again, it's not about you taking individual action. It's about the group taking action, and the group feeling a need to get something together. Although the army, if you look at it from a personal point of view, if you're not involved with other people, the army can be about bringing together everything you've got, and you see a challenge. Okay, at first, the previous hexagram was number 2, the receptive. You try to understand the challenge, but you don't do anything. Once you do understand it, once you're ready for action, it's about bringing everything together and just seeing what your role is. But ideally, you will be part of some collective enterprise, some collective endeavor, and you have strength in numbers, and so again, your individuality doesn't play much of a role here. It is about something larger than yourself. And that's I Ching. And now I want to look at Saturn in Aries. And I think that my description of Saturn in Aries is likely to be fairly chaotic, because it's difficult to be precise about what it means for Saturn in Aries. What can we actually expect? But we can be theoretical about it, certainly. So let's start by looking at the precise moment that Saturn moves into Aries. So here it is, Saturn in Aries. That's a precise moment, London time, that Saturn changes sign. Goes from Pisces into Aries. And Saturn is a great chronocrator. It's a ruler of time. And if we want to know what's happening down here on planet Earth, we need to look at Saturn. We also need to look at Jupiter. Jupiter is also a ruler of time, so the Jupiter-Saturn cycle is important. So Saturn is telling us something about what things are likely to happen. And Saturn in Aries, Saturn's moving into a fire sign. Saturn is also moving into its fall. So Saturn is exalted in Libra, therefore it's fallen in the sign of Aries. So you might then say that Saturn in Aries is bad, that the next few years are going to be difficult because Saturn is in Aries. That is, of course, a massive generalization. And what we might say, an alternative view, is to say that Saturn is weak. Saturn is about responsibility and what we have to do, and it's about contraction. It's from an economic point of view. That can be what Saturn is about. So if it's weak, you could say, well, the power of Saturn is weak. And of course, next month, Jupiter goes into Cancer. So we've got Jupiter moving into a sign of its exaltation and Saturn moving into a sign of its fall. So you might argue that Jupiter is now going to be, well, very soon is going to be in a much stronger position than Saturn. So that might indicate expansion, optimism. That is certainly a way of looking at it. So it's not all doom and gloom with Saturn moving into Aries, especially as Jupiter is about to move into Cancer. Remember, I'm looking at it from a sort of theoretical perspective. But another way of looking at it is Saturn in Aries, why is it fallen in Aries? Well, it makes sense. Saturn is about a planet which is about responsibility. And it's a time when we do have our responsibilities and we want to execute these responsibilities. And it's a kind of a slow-moving planet. But then it's in Aries. And so you could say that Saturn is, okay, on one hand, it's being undermined by being in Aries. It can't really function because things are too fast for Saturn. But you could also say that Aries is being undermined by Saturn. It's not usually the way you look at it, but people want to take the initiative in Aries. When Saturn is in Aries, they can't take the initiative and they get frustrated. So there could be a huge amount of frustration with Saturn moving into Aries. And it might be a time of frustration where people are so frustrated they have to just do things because they can't help themselves. So when people act with Saturn in Aries, they may do things in a clumsy way. They're not able to see it through spontaneously. I mean, Aries is supposed to be a spontaneous sign, but you throw Saturn in and it's completely unspontaneous. It's rather forced. So I think you can start to see why Saturn in Aries can be a problem. And this time round, with Saturn moving into Aries, every time is different. It is coloured by the fact that it is making a conjunction to Neptune, and Saturn and Neptune can put together. Well, one way of looking at Saturn and Neptune is about fear, we would love to move forward. Saturn in Aries, Neptune in Aries. We would love to. So many things to explore. So take the initiative. But you put Saturn and Neptune together, and yeah, we'd like to do things, but we can't because we're afraid and even paranoid. And that could be one way of looking at Saturn and Neptune. People are very afraid of the future, and of course, people are afraid of the future. That is true, but they also, want things to happen, and so there is a real issue there. So we might want to look back at previous times when Saturn went into Aries. So the last time Saturn went into Aries was in the mid 1990s. So actually here is here's the first time Saturn went into Aries in 1996. I mean, it went retrograde, went back into Pisces, but this was that movement into Aries. April the 7th, 1996, I think it's sort of 9:49 a.m. So the question is, while Saturn was moving through Aries in the late 1990s, did anything especially dramatic happen? Well, we might want to look at what happened the first few weeks of Saturn moving into Aries. Well, to give you an example of things that happened, that was on the 7th. Now, just before the 7th, on April the 6th, there was a civil war in Liberia. There was fighting breaking out in Monrovia. Rebel factions were struggling for supremacy. And then on April the 9th, April the 11th, so just 4 days after Saturn moved into Aries, there were events in the Middle East. The Israeli government launched Operation Grapes of Wrath, consisting of massive attacks on Lebanon in retaliation for terrorist attacks and sparking off a violent series of retaliations. Then on April the 18th, so a few weeks after Saturn moving into Aries, was the Qana massacre. Over 100 Lebanese civilians. So then it says over 100 Lebanese civilians are killed after Israel shells the United Nations compound in Qana. In reaction, an Islamist group in Egypt opens fire on a hotel, killing 18 Greek tourists and injuring 17 others. So there is real violence there. And then at the end of April in Australia, on April the 28th, the Port Arthur massacre. Martin Bryant kills 35 people at the Port Arthur tourist site in Tasmania. And then on the same day, there was a Bhai Feru bus bombing. A bomb explodes in Bhai Feru, Punjab, Pakistan, killing more than 60 people. So I know that bad things happen all the time, but maybe these bad things have a certain Saturn in Aries quality to them. There is a frustration, Israel feeling frustrated that things aren't moving fast enough with Saturn in Aries, that things aren't going their way, so they attack Lebanon. Then a terrorist group responds with killing all those Greek tourists. Or what was going on in the mind of Martin Bryant when he killed 35 people in April on April the 28th, 1996. Of course, massacres happen like this all the time. It's not just about Saturn in Aries, but maybe they have a particular Saturn in Aries quality to them, and so that might be how it works. Then Saturn also went into Aries in 1967 on March the 3rd, 1967. Of course, 1967. You think of the 60s. I mean, the Summer of Love was 1967. I don't know whether Saturn was in Aries during the summer of love of 1967. So if you look at the summer of, the hippies, and everything was beautiful with Saturn in Aries. Not really what you associate with Saturn in Aries, but if you look at the summer of, through the summer of 1967, Saturn was in Aries, and so that's not really what you associate with Saturn in Aries. But so you could say that it's a rebellion against Saturn. Saturn is restriction, and so people want to break free from restriction, and that may say something about the summer of love. But 1967 wasn't all about love and peace. Soon after Saturn went into Aries, there was a military coup in Greece, and the colonels took over, and so there were frustrations and problems brewing in Greece. And when Saturn went into Aries, that's when it when it all happened. So if you think of the 60s in terms of San Francisco and Haight-Ashbury and all of that kind of stuff, but if you were in Athens in 1967, a very, very different experience. And so we have to be careful when looking at history, not to be entirely focused on one culture. And going back to the Middle East, of course, 1967 saw the Six-Day War. Again, Saturn in Aries can be about sudden action, feeling you have to do something. And when the Israelis attacked the Arab air forces, in a few hours, completely destroyed the air forces of all its neighbours. So Saturn can be quite violent. Saturn in Aries, and it can be a resistance to authority, and it can be actually all of these things put together. And so if we try to bring 1967 and 1967 and 1996, and we kind of try to put it all together, and we look at what's going on. What's going on now? So going back to Saturn in Aries, right now, we can perhaps see all of it. The Middle East is again an area of drama. The Israelis are feeling frustrated. They're feeling they need to do stuff in Gaza, even though there is massive international opposition to Israeli actions. But it is being fueled, and given that the last two times Saturn went into Aries, the Israelis decided to take massive action. Six-Day War, Operation Grapes of Wrath in 1996. We might see it again, simply because it happened the last two times that Saturn was in this sign. And additionally, there is perhaps a resistance to authority, wanting to break free from authority. If you think about sort of 1967 and the summer of love, particularly as now Saturn is conjunct Neptune, people want to dissolve Saturn. People feel over-controlled, and so that may be a way it works. And then in other countries, looking at Greece in 1967, you want to overthrow the existing government, again, out of frustration. With this stuff, bear in mind that one might be trying too hard to find patterns. Human beings are very good at finding patterns, and this is always the problem with astrology. Astrologers are pattern finders, and we find patterns where perhaps nothing exists. So always, try to be a little skeptical when asking oneself, what does it mean for Saturn to be in Aries? And just wanted to consider also some other events. We can see Saturn in Aries in completely different ways, and Aries is the head, isn't it? And we shouldn't forget that Saturn in Aries, if it's a head, bad things happening to the head. The first guillotine, April the 25th, 1792, was, I believe, the first time that someone was guillotined. And in astrology, Aries rules the head, so a form of execution where someone is decapitated through this machine. You could say that is a Saturn in Aries event. I'm not saying that an American state is going to bring back the guillotine. That's an interesting idea. They're always concerned about finding different drugs, because there are bans on death penalty states getting drugs, and then having to use these rather horrific and bizarre ways of executing people, like giving people nitrogen. Maybe there's going to be some southern death penalty state with Saturn moving into Aries that might think that maybe the guillotine, maybe one of these states will think that's a good idea, but that would probably be regarded as being cruel and unusual. But then nitrogen seems to be a fairly cruel and unusual way of executing people. So that is. That's a possibility. And other events which took place in Saturn, with Saturn in Aries. Now, I've talked about the 60s, and there was also a lot of frustration in the 60s. We shouldn't forget the opposition to the late 60s. The Vietnam War. That's what happened during Saturn in Aries. The real protests against the Vietnam War. And so that could, Aries, is, you could say, well, it's America doing what it wants in Vietnam, and there is protest saying, no, this is not the right thing to do. And so protest could be an increasing part of what governments are having to experience with Saturn in Aries. If we go back to the late 1960s, what are people going to protest? Well, at the moment, people have been protesting about Palestine, but maybe there'll be other things that they're protesting about. People are starting to take to the streets, not just about Palestine, about a lot of other things. In fact, they're starting to take to the streets in some places about Ukraine. Maybe it's starting in continental Europe. People are starting to see the Ukraine war in a different way. But it may just be government authoritarianism, and government authoritarianism is seen in different ways. If you're in the US and you're a progressive, of course, your authoritarian is Trump. If you're on continental Europe, it's different. Your authoritarian is Macron, or governments on continental Europe, not just continental Europe, Britain as well, trying to crack down on free speech. So this may be a feature of Saturn moving into Aries if history repeats itself. And 1968, Saturn was in Aries. You had the frustrations of the Chicago Democratic Convention, which really didn't help the Democrats' chances of winning the 1968 election. That happened with Saturn moving through Aries, and of course you had the assassinations of Bobby Kennedy and Martin Luther King. So those assassinations, then it could just be a feeling of frustration. And you had all these hopes with Saturn in Aries, and what came of them? Absolutely nothing. And so with Saturn in Aries, I'm sort of reminded of that famous poem by Langston Hughes. So Langston Hughes is sort of African American poet who was he was part of the Harlem Renaissance in the 1960s, and he he wrote this poem called Harlem. I mean, it's a very famous. Probably if you're in America, you know this poem. But I'd never heard of Langston Hughes before I came to America, and he was talking about frustration, and he asks this question in his poem: what happens to a dream deferred? So Saturn in Aries, you have this dream. So with the Harlem Renaissance, it was a civil rights movement. Progress with civil rights seemed to be actually in the northern states, in New York, and for example, in the 1930s, and just before as the Depression, the recession, the Great Depression destroyed it all. But in the late 1920s, there was a lot of hope in the North, amongst the African American community, that things were getting better. But then it was a dream deferred, and then people forgot about it all, and then you had all of the brewing civil rights issues, coming up through the 1950s. And so, what does happen? And Langston Hughes asked this question: does this dream in his poem, does it dry up like a raisin in the sun? That's his image of a raisin in the sun. What happens to it? And he asked his question. Does it? And he, at the end of the poem, he says, maybe it just sags like a heavy load. But then he says, or does it explode? And that might be what Saturn in Aries is about. It is about a dream deferred. For many people, it all looked great. 1967, summer of love, everything was wonderful. That was a dream, but then the dream got deferred, and it got deferred, and it always gets deferred. And there may be a great sense of disappointment with Saturn in Aries. And so those are a few thoughts on Saturn in Aries. I wanted to end by very quickly looking at a few people with Saturn in Aries. I mean, I've got a long list of Saturn in Aries people, but I wanted to cut it short. And having Saturn in Aries in your horoscope is not the end of the world, even though it's supposed to be fallen. People have Saturn in Aries, and they are incredibly successful. And so George Washington had Saturn in Aries, and that didn't stop him being incredibly successful, defeating the British, becoming the first American president. And Saturn in Aries, how is he using that in a way that is useful? Well, I mean, that shows restraint and responsibility, and I think that was part of how he functioned, not just as a military leader, but as a president. He understood the limits, and he knew that you had to live in the real world. In the end, he had to make peace with the British, and he was able to define the US presidency. So yeah, he's an example of someone who did a good job with Saturn in Aries. But Saturn in Aries can be about taking something too far. You're in a hurry. And Edward Smith, the captain of the Titanic, had Saturn in Aries. And so that is a good example of Saturn in Aries not working especially well. So Saturn in Aries, you want to go fast, Aries, but Saturn, you hit an iceberg. And in his case, his life and his career, you could say, was really defined by that Saturn in Aries. Now, he did have Sun in Aquarius sextile Saturn in Aries. That might have helped him with his career, becoming a celebrity captain in the shipping line he was working for. But in the end, in his case, Saturn in Aries really did undo him. And moving to a sort of a more modern generation of people with Saturn in Aries, you could say with Saturn in Aries that you have a frustration. You feel you want to do something, and you just have to do it. And I'm thinking of David Frankfurter. He's someone I find interesting. So he was he was Croat. He was a Jewish, and he was from Croatia. And in the 1930s in Switzerland, he was clearly very unhappy about Nazism. And there was a Swiss Nazi called William Guslos, and he didn't like that, and he assassinated Wilhelm Guslos. He went into his office in Davos and shot him, and was sentenced to prison in life, given a life prison sentence, which probably saved his life, because if he'd been out and about in Europe, he would have been caught up in the Holocaust. But as it happened, he spent the war in a prison in a neutral country, and after the end of the war was released and went to Israel. So that might be how Saturn in Aries works. In his case, you feel that you have to you have to do something. Saturn in Aries, you can't tolerate the situation any longer. And additionally, someone else born in 1908 was Salvador Allende, who was the Chilean president, who was overthrown by an American-backed coup, which brought in Augusto Pinochet. And so he had Saturn in Aries. So he is trying to be president of Chile, but it's incredibly frustrating. Now, by the way, in a chart like this, you could say, well, Saturn in Aries is an outer planet; it's affecting everyone. But maybe Saturn in Aries particularly affects people who are famous or who have real power, like Salvador Allende did for a time when he was president of Chile. But again, it was frustrating having Saturn in Aries, especially when the United States is doing everything they can to undermine your authority, to undermine your economy, and to support your enemies. So he is perhaps an example of someone who was certainly having difficulties with Saturn in Aries, and of course his Sun in Cancer was square Saturn in Aries. So that would have been extremely frustrating, having Sun in Cancer. Yeah, having Sun in Cancer, making a square to Saturn, and then we skip a generation. So we skip, because when you have to think after 1908, then of course Saturn went into Aries in the late 1930s, and so an example of someone of that generation would be Saddam Hussein, born in 1937, Saturn in Aries. Look at Saddam Hussein's Saturn. Saturn has 0 degrees Aries. So Saddam Hussein would have been a very Saturnine person. And in this case, Saturn in Aries is about control, wanting complete control, and regarding everything as being really tough. You make a single mistake, you'll be killed. And so as he became a resistance leader, as he going up through the ranks of the Ba'athist Party, he knew it was a dog-eat-dog world with Saturn in Aries. And again, Saturn, not just Saturn in Aries, Saturn on the Aries point. So he perhaps very much manifests that Saturn in Aries, and that Saturn is trine Mars. So he understood the importance of violence, and in fact Saturn is making a grand trine, Saturn, Mars, Pluto. He's got Saturn on the Mars-Pluto midpoint. So someone who is capable of incredible violence, and because he understood that the world it's a difficult world out there, and so that's the kind of world that he was brought up, that he was brought up in, that he got used to, that he had to deal with. And so 1930s, and we move on to the next time Saturn was in Aries was of course in the late 1960s, and a lot of current politicians have their Saturn in Aries, and they don't seem to be having too many problems. So it's not such a bad thing having Saturn in Aries. But a few Saturn in Aries people who come to mind Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, has Saturn in Aries. And it may be that at the moment his Saturn in Aries is starting to manifest. He does have Saturn in the 7th house, and he's clearly someone who is very ambitious. He does not have Dikbala, by the way. I mean, Dikbala, if you have Saturn in the 7th house in your Vedic chart, that can make you very strong and make you very difficult to beat. But in his Vedic chart, actually, his Saturn is in the 8th house. But so for him, Saturn in Aries, yeah, it could be frustrating. He wants power, he wants political power, he wants to be president, but there's a lot to frustrate him. He's got his own rivals, he's got his own issues in California, so you can see perhaps how he's working with that Saturn in Aries. And is that Saturn in Aries going to stop him becoming a US president? Not in itself, no. I mean, I don't think, from what I know, that or what I believe at the moment, I haven't really looked at it astrologically, I don't think that he's going to win the 22 or going to get anywhere with the 2028 election. My feeling at the moment is that the Republicans are going to win it again. I'll go into that in more detail at a later stage. Another person from a completely different background who had Saturn in Aries was Mohammed Atta. And so Mohammed Atta was, we don't have a time of birth for him, was how he was the man who sort of led the attack on 9/11, the 9/11 attacks. And so, yeah, lots of people have Saturn in Aries and they have perfectly nice lives, but for him, it could have been more of a problem. His Saturn is in Aries, both in the Vedic horoscope, in the sidereal horoscope, and in the tropical horoscope. So that Saturn could have been a problem for him. He seems to have been quite sort of frustrated. We know that he had sort of issues with the opposite sex when he was awarded some diploma when he was studying in Germany, and he refused to shake hands with a woman awarding the diploma. But with Saturn in Aries, got to do something. What was he going to do? And what he felt he had to do was blow up the World Trade Center. Of course, there are different views about what actually happened. And a politician who I do think really does get the full destructive power of Saturn and Aries in a way is Marine Le Pen. So Marine Le Pen, head of the National Rally, clearly she wants to be president. I've always had issues with her chart. I just don't think that she's got the luck to be French president. And that Saturn in Aries, it's in Aries in both the Vedic horoscope and in the Western horoscope. Things are frustrating for her. She nearly gets there. She's obviously she's got to the final round of the French presidential elections twice. Now she's been banned from standing in the next presidential election. So life for her is frustrating, but of course she does have Saturn trine Venus, so she is able to project herself, and she has the discipline to be an effective party leader. But I do feel with her chart she does illustrate some of the problems that Saturn in Aries can have. And also, by the way, Timothy McVeigh, we remember Mohammed Atta, he was responsible for the 9/11 attacks. Timothy McVeigh was responsible for the attack on that building in Oklahoma in, was it 1996? So for him, the Saturn in Aries, he's got Saturn conjunct Venus. I mean, he's got Saturn in the 10th house. So he, as a person, he feels frustrated, and he's got Saturn, Venus, North Node conjunction. He feels it's something he needs to do, and he's quite sort of ruthless about it. A lot of people died, innocent. Well, obviously, whenever people always say innocent people died when there was a terrorist attack. Well, people are innocent anyway. They always put that. Well, why would they not be innocent? But a lot of people died in this Oklahoma attack, and he was eventually executed, and so he perhaps illustrates the frustration of Saturn in Aries, and then what do you do about it? And then after that, 1968, and then in the 1990s, Saturn was again in Aries, and one example of someone who has Saturn in Aries, I don't have his time of birth, is Luigi Mangione, who has been accused of killing the CEO of United Healthcare, and so I can't really say anything about it, but he does have Saturn in he does have Saturn in Aries. So Luigi Mangione has Saturn in Aries in both his Vedic chart and both his tropical chart as well. So that is a difficult placement, and it certainly must be frustrating being imprisoned on trial, being tried for an offence which could lead to the death penalty. So I believe that federal prosecutors are seeking the death penalty for him, and so that is happening to him. Saturn in Aries, but we must remember with Luigi Mangione, it's innocent till proven guilty. It could well be a case of mistaken identity, but I'm still demonstrating that, showing you that Luigi Mangione has Saturn in Aries, and you can read what you like into that. So those are my thoughts on Saturn in Aries. It was rather all over the place. I'm not sure if I've really given you any clear indications about what we might expect now that Saturn is moving into Aries, but maybe I've given a few hints, and we'll have to see how it works out. And it's certainly a subject that I will be returning to, hopefully in the near future. So thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, I'd be very grateful if you were to like it. If you're not subscribed, I would be very grateful if you were to subscribe. If you want to buy me a coffee, there's a link in the description, and I will talk to you again very soon.